though I have ostensibly 2 more lectures of a title, The Vegetarianism of Gnostic Christianity and the Non-Vegetarianism of Catholic Christianity. And essentially how vegetarianism was lost from the Christian religion. I'm going to have later somebody come in and turn the slide right now.
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, you can press the arrow for the next slide. Why don't we turn the lights out in the room? You can't really see the screen at all with the lights on. I picked this up off the internet, so I hope you all didn't read it. I thought it was interesting. It had a very religious tone, so I included it. Judaic Christianity began in about 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. And how can I say that Christianity started before Jesus was born? And that is largely because Jesus was born into a society that preached what he taught rather than that he created it out of scratch from nothing. If we can have the next slide.
Yeah, okay.
In ancient times, I'll start where it is. In the 21st century, today, we have essentially 3 major forms of Christianity: Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and all the Protestant churches as a lump, including the large Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria in Egypt, which is kind of traveled a separate road from the rest of Christianity. So these are what we have today. If we have the next slide. In ancient times, we had 3 Christian churches: the Judaic Christian Church, the Gnostic Christianity, and Catholic Christianity. These were competing for members from the very earliest of times, and there was a brutal battle between them. Some of my data that I received to describe these different churches comes from the Catholic Fathers, and they wrote very harsh criticism of the other 2 churches, the Judaic Christians and the Gnostic Christians, calling them heretics, of course. But in their calling them heretics, they gave us information about them, invaluable information. But otherwise, they destroyed all their books. There isn't a single book remaining from Gnostic Christianity, not a single book remaining from Judaic Christianity. They were all burned and destroyed. So the only knowledge that we have about their existence is what Catholic Christianity gives us today. Next slide, please. I have to go back to the very, very beginnings that we can trace back of Christianity as expressed in Judaic Christianity, back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras, you may have all heard, was a philosopher of 500 BC who was more than just a person who recited philosophic concepts. He created a movement. It was vegetarian. It was they were pacifists. They did not believe in violence in any form. They had a communal society. And curiously, I include this last one, which may not have been that important, Pythagoras' prohibition of swearing. He said, if you have to swear by God, then your word isn't to be trusted any time. You should be absolutely trustworthy without having to swear. Next slide. Judaic doctrine at the time of Pythagoras had a concept called animal sacrifice. I don't know how many of you know that, but it's the book of Leviticus and Numbers is just filled with instructions on how to sacrifice an animal, the ceremony was held in the temple. The priest took the animal brought in by the sinner, and presumably everybody was sinning, so they all brought in their animals to the priest. The priest, in a ceremony that I don't know exists, transferred the sins of that person into the animal. And then they killed the animal as punishment for your sins. So the word scapegoat got its origin from this concept that the human being walked away sin-free and the animal was dead from the person's sins. The meat was eaten by the priests and their families, and the temple workers ate their share of the meat. It was a source of meat in a society that didn't have any qualms about eating meat and was looked upon as very, very valuable reason to become a priest. Paul, in one of his letters, states that you know that the temple workers share in the sacrifices. I'm paraphrasing what he said. Because evidently they thought that maybe only the priests ate the meat, but everybody that worked in the temple got their share of it. Militarism, I don't believe anybody has ever accused the Israelis of being pacifists, and they weren't then and they aren't now, and so they had a militaristic society. Communalism, there were some isolated communities that were not Pythagorean. The Qumran monastery had a Jewish commune that was not in any way the Essenes or any way related to them. So I would just say now that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not Essene literature, and the society that lived at the Qumran monastery were not Essene. I can argue that point at another time. I think it's toward the end of my lecture if I ever get there. Oaths. The Jewish concept of taking oaths was outlined in several places. Numbers has it, if a man swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. So in Judaism, oaths were a part of the religion, but Pythagoras taught against it. Pythagoras died with most of his following in his presence, but afterward his disciples spread through the Mediterranean area, converting communities into Pythagoreanism. In fact, if you were a vegetarian at the time that Jesus lived, and a century or two thereafter, you would be called a Pythagorean. They had no word for vegetarianism in any of the languages. And so when the Pythagorean communities developed, the word Pythagorean meant vegetarian, among other things. Next slide. In Palestine, the Pythagoreans developed among a group of celibate men who lived in communes in the rural areas, the Essenes. Most people have heard of the Essenes. They were a brotherhood of men. I suggest that they might have been a homosexual group of men because they lived away from women and did not associate with them. They had the interesting aspect that orphan boys in Judea were taken to the Essene commune to be raised because they did not marry, they didn't have any way to replace their body, and so by adopting these boys or orphans, they had a replacement continuously for their society. The women, the girls that were made orphans, were taken in the temple, and they had a place for the orphan girls in the temple, and they had a house mother who stayed there all the time to make sure the priest didn't molest them. And that's a little tongue-in-cheek thing. We don't know any accusations of that. The house mother that's most famous is Anne. So to those of you who know that after Jesus was born, Joseph and Mary took Jesus as a baby to visit with Anne, probably because Mary was one of these temple virgins, and therefore after Joseph, an orphan raised by the Essenes, came to the temple looking for a bride, and he was given Mary by the priest. They came back to present Jesus to Anne, who was probably in Mary's mind her mother. It wasn't her biological mother, but the mother who took care of her. There's another group of Essenes that is described by Philo of Alexandria called the Therapeutae. The Therapeutae were known as that because they were renowned physicians of the area. They were probably the best medical facility in the world at the time, or at least the Western world. They are known for reading literature from the ancients and accumulating all the wealth of knowledge of medicine at the time. And I would say we should not poo-poo them as bad physicians, because they may have known about digitalis to treat congestive heart failure. They may have known about molds and their effect against bacteria and being able to treat bacterial infections. So they may have had more knowledge than what we give them credit for. It is possible, but I have not read this anywhere, that their literature was preserved in the library of Alexandria, which was, you all know, was burned down in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, and all that literature is now lost. So we don't really know what they knew. We just knew them as renowned physicians. Next. Next. Judaic Christianity probably began several centuries before Jesus was born. The Pythagorean disciples out of Greece migrated to the rest of the Mediterranean world and converted people, and there was a group of Jews in Judea that probably liked the Pythagorean doctrine, adopted it, and ultimately they were known as the Essenes. I would like to just mention a brief comment on Gnostic Christianity. My opinion is Paul, the famous Paul, started Gnostic Christianity. And so he began proselytizing probably around 40 CE. So that is the beginning of Gnostic Christianity. So Judaic Christianity preceded it, and Catholic Christianity probably started around 80 CE, 40 years after Gnostic Christianity began. And Catholic Christianity probably started when John the priest, John the beloved disciple of the fourth gospel, who is by several authorities a Jewish priest, was probably captured by the Romans when the Romans burned Jerusalem in 70 AD and taken as a political prisoner to the island of Patmos. The island of Patmos, he probably stayed as a prisoner for about 9 years and had some hallucinations and wrote them down in a book called Revelations. And so if you imagine this priest being held in a bad prison in Patmos, you can maybe understand how Revelations was conceived and written. And nevertheless, when the Roman emperor dies, all the political prisoners of the previous emperor are released from prison. It was just a custom, so when an emperor died in around 79 or 80 AD CE, the prisoners on Patmos was released. John was a prisoner there, recorded in the Bible, as well as history. And he took a boat off the island and headed for the mainland. The town that exists in Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, just off of Patmos, the town is Ephesus. You might remember Ephesus from the letter to the Ephesians, which Paul wrote. So there at Ephesus was a Christian community of Gnostic Christians, and John the priest from Judaism came there and was probably the only known living person to have known Jesus personally in 80 AD. If you can imagine following a new religion, and the prophet had been crucified in about 36 AD, and all the disciples are now dead, and here comes out of Patmos the priest who loves Jesus. And so that probably anything the priest said, the Gnostic Christians in Ephesus probably followed. He probably set up a priest-oriented church with him as the bishop, and it developed then and spread out into other Gnostic Christian churches and elsewhere as well. John the Priest was probably the origin of the priesthood in Catholic Christianity. Next slide. There are multiple names that we give to Judaic Christians, and so sometimes when you're looking it up in a book and you want to find a title called Judaic Christianity, you're not going to find it anyplace. So what you have to look at is the Essenes, the Therapeutae, the Nazarenes, and the Ebionites. I would like to say a word about the Nazarenes. The word is a puzzlement even to scholars. And in the New Testament, the word Nazarenes is written about 16 times. But they're in two forms. And one is like an S, Nazarenes, and the other is Nazarenes. And they puzzled over what is the difference between the two words of the Nazarene. The concept of Nazarenes came because Jesus lived in Nazareth, and therefore he was called a Nazarene, and therefore all his disciples were called Nazarenes. Doesn't stand up historically. Nobody else ever in history was referred to as being from Nazareth. So therefore, the only person that ever had been given that word, Jesus of Nazareth, was Jesus. But presumably other people came from Nazareth and would be called John of Nazareth or Paul of Nazareth and so forth. But none exist in history. So the city of Nazareth never existed in any historical documents until about the 3rd, 4th century AD. There is no mention of Nazareth in the Old Testament. There is no mention of Nazareth in the Josephus, who talks a lot about the area of Galilee because he was from that area. He talks about town after town after town, never mentions Nazareth. And all the old maps that we have of the area, there is no Nazareth there. So Nazareth never appears in history until it comes into the New Testament. And somebody's trying to make Jesus' membership in an organization called the Nazarenes defunct. And so they say that's not where the word came from. It was he was born in Nazareth. And the word may have just been made up at that time because the town never existed. We have a town named Nazareth in Israel at this time, created by Helen or Helene Constantine, Emperor Constantine's mother. Okay? She was a very gung-ho woman who pushed her son into the emperorship, and she also continued to work for him quite a bit while he was emperor. And there was a movement by Constantine at that time to incorporate the Christian church, which prior to him were being persecuted. They were sending them to the lions in the Colosseum, and they would put them in chairs, strap them in the chairs, and then light a fire in the chair like an oven and cook them alive. And people would watch them screaming in agony as they burned to death. These were what happened to Christians. And Constantine said, well, you become my church, the church of the state, and we will stop all of that. So there was a strong desire for people not to be persecuted anymore because it was a horrible persecution. So Constantine incorporated the Christian church as a state religion in about 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. Back to Nazareth, so his mother went to Palestine and was determined to find all these holy sites. And she could not find a town named Nazareth. So she picked a small town in Galilee and said, this is Nazareth. And she changed the name. Constantine recognized the name. It now became a name on maps. It was officially Nazareth. But it never existed in Jesus' lifetime. Jesus was a Nazarene because the society of the Nazarenes existed before Jesus was born. I quickly ran through a scenario in which Joseph may have been, there's no history on this, Joseph may have been an orphan who grew up in the Essenes as an orphan, since the Essenes took orphans and raised them, and they were the only orphanage in Palestine, so people brought the orphan children left without parents to them. And when these young orphan boys grew up, they were heterosexual. And they didn't want to be in the society of the homosexual men. They wanted a wife, they wanted children, they wanted to pull themselves out and live in the society with women and children. So, you know, in that time, in that era of Judaism, the father arranged with another father for the children to be married. So the father of a girl would go to a father of a boy and they'd say, I like my daughter to marry your son. And that was the way people got married. It was arranged. So the Essene boys, the orphans, had no way to acquire a wife because they didn't have a father to go to another father to arrange for the marriage. So they went to the temple where the temple virgins were kept as orphans until they were about ready to have a menstrual period. As you might know, in Judaism, having a menstrual period is being unclean, and therefore no woman could be in the temple during a menstrual cycle, because that would defile the temple. So before the young girl would have a menstrual period, they married them off, and the Essene young orphans were a good source of men for the temple virgins. And that might be the origin of Mary being a virgin, that she was one of the temple virgins. Nevertheless, whenever he married her and they had children, they became a part of the married Essenes. Josephus speaks of the married Essenes, but never gives them a name. I'm giving them the name Nazarenes, because that's essentially what the Nazarenes are, married Essenes. And the Nazarenes lived in all the towns of Judea. They lived in Galilee, they lived in Bethlehem, they lived in whatever the town was that ultimately became Nazareth. Nazarenes was a movement of married Essenes. The third word here is Ebionites. The Catholic Church began calling the Judaic Christians heretics. And in calling them heretics, they had to give them the name if it wasn't in the Bible. And the word Nazarene is in the Bible in the Acts of the Apostles, where the Jewish mob says that Paul is a ringleader of the Nazarenes, which demonstrates, as I said, that Nazarenes was a group of people, a movement of which Paul became a prominent leader. And the word Nazarenes being mentioned in the Bible multiple times, they couldn't say these descendants of Nazarenes are heretics, so they gave them another name. They called them Ebionites. And evidently there was a man by the name of Ebion in about 100 AD who was a prominent Christian leader, and they probably tagged it from that name as that group. So if you're looking in the literature and you see Ebionites, say Judaic Christians. The next one. I don't know where I was going with this slide, but one of the Essenes and the Nazarenes were not loved by the Orthodox Jewish organization. In Jesus' lifetime, the Orthodox Judaism was centered in the temple under the authority of the priest and the high priest. And they had concepts that the Nazarenes did not believe in at all. In fact, the Nazarenes, as recorded in the recognitions and homilies of Clement, interpreted the Old Testament in quite a different way than what we or the Orthodox Judaism interpreted. So they were hostile to each other. By the turn in the 1st century AD, there was an anathema written by the rabbis that every day the Orthodox Jew was to recite, in which they cursed the Nazarenes. death to the Nazarenes, or sort of you would say. So the Orthodox Judaism wasn't in any way in friendship with Judaic Christianity, cursed them in an anathema, and never really felt them to be Jews. The Catholic Church is coming from the other side and saying that they're not Christians either. Jerome, an early Catholic writer about 3rd, 4th century, said the Judaic Christians wish to be both Jews and Christians, but in the end they are neither Jews nor Christians, and neither group liked them. So here they were, the descendants of Jesus, probably the most honest and true descendants of Jesus, and knowing what Jesus taught and followed it in their life. And they were ostracized both by Judaism and by Christianity. Go to the next slide. I have a question here that I don't have an answer for. Is that did the Palestinian and Alexandrian Essenes accept Jesus as a true prophet and therefore become Christians? Or did they remain just Essenes as they were before Jesus' lifetime and remain until they disintegrated and disappeared? The Roman soldiers in 70 CE, according to Josephus, tried to torture the Essene men to give up their testimony of meat and pacifism. They would, the Romans had meat in their diets. They would take the meat and stuff it into the mouth of the Essenes, trying to get them to eat the meat, and the Essenes would not swallow it. They would not eat it. And then they started torturing them, trying to get them to rebel and to violently attack the Roman soldier. And the Essenes never did it. And the Roman soldiers just killed them. You know, don't have any time for this pacifism. So the Essenes held on to their concept of vegetarianism and pacifism right to the very end under the most brutal of circumstances one could imagine, and they held on to their testimony. They were truly true Christians. Next. The internet has just all kinds of things. Next one. The story of Jesus cleansing the temple has to be kind of mentioned here. The story as we receive it in Christianity and in the New Testament is that Jesus didn't like the idea of a dishonest money changers. As you know, if you've ever traveled to a foreign country, one of the first things you do when you get in that country is exchange your American dollars for the money of the country you're going to. Because a lot of places where you want to buy something don't take American dollars. Now we have a little bit more worldwide recognition of dollars than, say, other monies, but most of the time you go to this exchange. The dollar, the money changers in that country will give you the country's money for your own money. And that existed in the temple in Jerusalem because it was the command for all good Orthodox Jews to make one trip to Jerusalem in their lifetime and sacrifice an animal to relieve their sins so that they could then have eternal life. And of course, if you lived in Egypt or what is now Turkey and so forth, and you're making the pilgrimage down to Jerusalem, you're not going to drive an animal several hundred miles on the dirt roads and try to get that animal there in good shape. So you're planning on taking your money and buying an animal in the temple and then sacrificing that animal. And the temple very conveniently had animals for sale there. And they housed them in the temple somewhere, I don't know. And they sold them to Jews coming in from all over the world. The Jew would go to the money changers, get their money exchanged, and then go buy the animal that they wanted to sacrifice. And then they would take that animal before the priest. The priest would transfer the sins of the person to the animal, slaughter the animal, and then the priest would take the next person in line while the animal was moved back to a worker in the temple to finish the slaughter and the butchering of the animal. And then the meat, as I said, was divided among everybody that worked there, including the priest's family. The priest only probably participated in the ritual slaughter of the killing of the animal and not the butchering of the animal afterwards. But nevertheless, the money changers were there to allow all these pilgrims a chance to buy an animal to give to the sacrifice ceremony. Jesus and the Essenes and the Nazarenes and the Ebionites and all of them detested the animal sacrifice ritual in the temple. They thought it was an abomination to do that in the name of God. And so they were very powerless, and generally they just ignored it, went on their way, and left the temple be the slaughterhouse in which it was. And by the way, the eternal light that Kennedy put on his tomb, taken from the Bible, the eternal, is that the eternal light?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Is actually a barbecue pit. They were roasting the animals over top of it. And they never let the barbecue pit go out because the bringing in the animals for slaughter to the priest was so heavy and continuous that if they let the barbecue pit go out, they would never get it hot enough to cook the animals again to keep for all of the amount of animals they were slaughtering in the animal sacrifice cult. So that's why it was the eternal flame. They just kept it going all the time. And you know, wood was scarce in Palestine, so to keep it going all the time was a big deal. But that's a recognition of how busy the animal sacrifice ceremony was. And just to go back a little bit on Jesus, Jesus escaped from Palestine as a child, as you read in the New Testament, and his father took him to Egypt. If you read the Bible, you will never find a place that says how long Jesus stayed in Egypt. But it does say that when Herod died, that he came back. My argument is that Jesus was taken to Egypt at about 23 BC. And he stayed there until about 3 BC, a year after Herod died. And then he came back as a physician to Palestine. That Jesus was a trained physician in the best medical school in the world, the medical school of the Therapeutic. They had the best knowledge of medicine at the time. He came back to Palestine, and people just chased after him to get cured of their disease. They would crowd around him. They would enclose him in a crowd that he couldn't even get his breath, sort of. He had to kind of get people to move them out. And they dropped people down through the ceilings, or down into the maybe the opening plaza in the middle of a house that those houses had, in order to get to him. He was such in great demand as a physician of the time. I also argue that no carpenter would ever say, "You might say to me, physician, heal thyself." Only a physician gets to have that curse set upon him. Physician, heal thyself. So he was looked upon as a physician by everybody. And Origen, an early Catholic father, said, no place in the New Testament does it ever say that Jesus was a carpenter. It is believed that Joseph was a carpenter, but not Jesus. I think it's in Mark's recollection it says, "Are you not Jesus, the son of the carpenter?" And then in Matthew, and I probably got them mixed up, it says, "Are you not Jesus, the son of Joseph? Are you not Jesus, the carpenter, the son of Joseph?" They flipped it around and made Jesus the carpenter instead of Joseph the carpenter. But imagine Jesus as a physician, a very renowned physician, a very influential person because he can cure people and other people can't. And so he's got a lot of influence. And he stayed among the Nazarenes in Galilee. Yes?
15 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. He stayed among the Nazarenes in Galilee, treating people in that area. He also wandered distance. If we take Mark for an accurate interpretation of his tours, he would make, as an itinerant physician, tours through the Mediterranean area, Tyre and some other cities. He would go there and treat people, and they probably all gathered around him, and he arrived a very renowned position. So he appears in the temple, probably for the first time in his life, in 27 AD. And he sees the animal sacrifice going on. When I speak to vegetarians, I think you must understand me better than any other group could understand how Jesus felt seeing the animals killed. To other people, it's routine. You know, they do it all the time. But to Jesus, it was an abomination he could not tolerate. So he took a cord of rope, a whip of cords, okay? And he got into these corrals where the animals were being held so they could be sold to the pilgrims for the sacrifice. He opened the gates and went in there and just beat the animals as a farmer might do, enough to get them to stampede out of the corrals onto the streets. He opened up the cages of the pigeons, and he got the sheep out and drove them out of the temple. He drove the animals out of the temple because he was protesting the animal sacrifice cult as a vegetarian. Okay? Now, out front, where you enter the temple, is the desk of the money changers. As the pilgrims come in, they meet the money changers first, get their money changed, and then they go back in and they buy the animal. So out comes all this stampede of cattle and sheep and everything that Jesus is chasing, and it upsets the carts and the tables of the money changers. That's how the tables became upset. Not that Jesus did it. Jesus was chasing the animals out. There's a recording in the Judaic literature that, of course, I told you is all destroyed, but it was preserved by Jerome and I believe Epiphanius. And Jesus said somewhere, I have come to abolish animal sacrifices. And if you do not cease sacrificing, my anger shall not cease from you. Where would he possibly say that? He would say it after the high priest was called. Hey, there's some crazy guy there driving all the animals out on the street. And the high priest comes and confronts him, and he says this to the high priest. It doesn't fit any place else except in that moment and that interpretation of it. So Jesus became a personal enemy of the established Judaic hierarchy, the high priest and the chief priest and the lowly street priests and so forth. And the animosity continued until they found a later opportunity to get Jesus handed over to Pilate and have him executed. And then they were rid of the ringleader vegetarian. Now I have the next one. You all may walk out at 1:30, give me my copy.
2:30.
I say Judaic Christian was Pythagorean Judaism, with the addition of Jesus as the true prophet. Now the word true prophet is the way that they refer to Jesus in the Clementine recognitions and homilies. The Clementine recognitions and homilies are two books that they said are written by the second Pope of the Catholic Church, Clement, about his recollection of his friendship with Peter. And it is thought that buried in that book is the couple of Judaic-Christian documents called the Journeys of Peter, the Preachings of Peter, and the Ascents of James. James, Jesus' brother, supposedly wrote that book. And they had probably good inkling at that time that the books are going to be burned. There's such hostility toward the Judaic Christians that their books are going to be burned. So what better way than to incorporate it into a novel about the second Pope of the Roman Catholic Church? Because the church won't burn a book about their Pope, right? And in it is embedded all this history of the Judaic Christians. And a lot of the data that I'm giving you comes from the Clementine recognitions and homilies. Another Catholic writer who documented that was Epiphanius, the bishop of Cyprus. And he wrote a history of the Nazarenes who preceded Jesus, he called them Nazarenes, and the Nazarenes who followed Jesus, called the Nazarenes, and the Ebionites who were what they were called later. And a lot of the data that we know about the Judaic Christians comes from him. And he also quotes from the journeys of Peter, and it's identical to what's in the Clementine Recognitions, which makes us realize that that book is incorporated in the Clementine homilies. Jesus repeatedly says in the Bible, "Ye have heard it said of old, but I say unto you." And every time he says that, "I say unto you," he's inserting the Pythagorean doctrine. Next time. Hegesippus was a Jewish Christian, but not a Judaic Christian. He joined the Catholic Church, but he was Jewish. So he's a Jewish Christian, but not a Judaic Christian. I separate the two that way. Judaic Christianity was a separate sect, and you didn't just become a member of the Judaic Christian Church by joining a Roman Catholic Church as a Jew. Epiphanius lived much later, and he is a great source of Judaic Christianity information. Hegesippus, his books are destroyed, and the interesting thing is they were intact at the time of Constantine and Eusebius, and Eusebius quotes long sections from it, and then the book is gone. So in my opinion, they couldn't burn Eusebius's book, so they burned Hegesippus's book, because otherwise it should have been preserved by the church. The only other possibility is in the catacombs of the Vatican, and they won't release it. I don't know.
Quick question. The second person, Epiphanius, was that AD or BC, CD rather?
Yeah, he was after Jesus' time. Both were CE.
Okay.
Did I fail to? Yeah. Epiphanius, I didn't put CE or BC. Yeah. He was about later than Constantine, and he was in the multiple other squabbles, which I won't get into, but he was never real powerful in the church. Next slide.
That is. Again? Okay.
These are the three books that I mentioned, and also there was a gospel according to the Hebrews. We only have scattered information about it as quoted by Epiphanius, Jerome, and other Catholics because the originals are all destroyed. Next slide. This is an interesting side comment I put in here. Wadi al-Nasara, Arabic for the Valley of Christians. And I wanted to point out the word Nasara, that in Arabic the word derived from the Hebrew means Christians, Nazarenes, Nasara, Nazarenes. It's a popular site in Syria, and since Syria is on the news so much, I thought you might be interested in where they live. Next slide. And here is the area right here north of Lebanon in which the Christians live. They're a part of the Greek Orthodox Church, but they're quite plentiful in that area, and most of the world that are surrounding them is Arab and Muslims. The three different names for Judaic Christianity. Next slide. This is a comment that Pliny the Elder talked about a group of Nazareans, once again that word coming up, that existed 20 to 30 BCE before the birth of Christ. The archaeologist Dubourg estimates that if they were where he says in Syria by 30 or 20 BC, they probably existed at least 20 or 30 years in Palestine earlier. So he would date at least 50 BCE the existence of Judaic Christianity, which means Judaic Christianity preceded the birth of Christ. Next slide. That's too much. Let's go to the next one. This is talking about the fact that there are two words representing Nazarene in the New Testament, and they were used 13 times in the one form and 6 in the other form, and why the difference in form, and I don't think they ever solved the problem, but certainly Epiphanius refers to one group of Nazarenes with an S and another group of Nazarenes, and one preceded Jesus' lifetime and one was after Jesus' lifetime. I don't know what all that means. Next one. Saying that Nazareth did not exist and Ebion was a early Judaic Christian in maybe the 1st or 2nd century, and they then called the Judaic Christians Ebionites after that. Next slide. This is a quotation from Epiphanius certifying that Peter was a vegetarian. There are Hegesippus certified that James, the Lord's brother, was a vegetarian. And there's another reference that I'm not sure the Catholic father who stated that Matthew was a vegetarian. We don't have a lot of certifications of every apostle being a vegetarian. But when you put the whole movement together and you look at it as a movement from ancient pre-Christian era to about 400 AD, you see a movement of vegetarians. And so I strongly suggest that Jesus was a vegetarian. And the best smoking gun I can come up with is Epiphanius says to the Judaic Christian, "Why don't you eat meat?" And the Jewish Christian says back, according to Epiphanius, "Because Jesus taught us that." And that is the best smoking gun I can come up with. A lot of the New Testament was altered in the very earliest of days of its writings. They never became real stable until they were canonized in about the 4th century. So whenever a document came out from, say, Mark in Egypt, and they said, well, this has him as a vegetarian, so we can't have that. So they would just copy it with him eating some fish or so in order to take out that aspect. I think if you look at the history, Jesus is a vegetarian, and the Judaic Christians were vegetarians who practiced also pacifism and communalism. And you put those three together into a group, and they become a hostile group to the government. And it was part of this pacifism, vegetarian communalism that spread into Gnostic Christianity that caused the Roman emperors to put them before the lions. And as soon as the Christians picked up a gun and were willing to fight for the state, no more persecution. You're one of us now. And that's what's ended. I'll take questions, so maybe people will have any questions about what I said.
Are there traces of Judaic Christianity scripture from Kerala, India, that originated in Syria?
I've never gone into the Christianity in India, and I've read some of the books that write about it. There's also books that write about Jesus going to Spain. There are also books that say that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, and their daughter was the early progenitor of the Knights Templar. Yeah, thank you. And I stayed away from those because I did not think they were historical. They were more recollections of later writers. And I tried to stay with the primary source material that I had. Primary source material is Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, the early Catholic fathers, and namely that is literature. There's also a Slavonic edition of Josephus, which gives a rendition of John the Baptist as being a vegetarian. And so I stuck with that literature in order that I would not be challenged that I am making it up as I go. Anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. You said that there are no surviving Gnostic texts. What about the Nag Hammadi?
Yeah, you're probably right in correcting me that. That didn't survive because they allowed them to exist. It survived because they buried them in a jar and we discovered them 2,000 years later or so. And you are correct. The Nag Hammadi library is Gnostic literature and is now available since about 1946 when they discovered it.
Have you looked through those texts to see anything about vegetarianism?
I read the entire Nag Hammadi library translated into English, and I did not find any text that added anything to me. The Gnostic Christians, some of them adopted vegetarianism and some did not. And that literature that's out of Nag Hammadi didn't mention much about vegetarianism. I don't think I used any of the information I got from that in my conclusions that I give you today. I also read the Dead Sea Scrolls translated into English, and I came up with the conclusion they were not Essenes.
What about the Essene Gospels?
These are written late. They have no historical significance. I read through them and I loved them, but I was just loving them because I wanted that to be that way. But there's no real evidence that any of that ever came from 2,000 years ago.
So they were not discovered at the same time as the...
I don't think there's any Essene Gospels that are discovered in that.
I thought they were discovered around the same time as the scrolls.
I don't even know if people believed that they were discovered. They were just written and the person said that they were discovered. I think they lose a lot of credibility as a historical document. They probably have a nice literature value, but not historical value.
There's one Essene Gospel, I think it's Peace, Enter Bordeaux. There was a Vatican radio set. It came from Vatican from a secret area. And so it was verified on Vatican radio.
And it came from a certain part of the Vatican library that was not available to people?
Yeah, I think it was in Bordeaux.
And I've never heard of this
Okay,
song.
I can give you some information.
Sure, I appreciate that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Are there any remnants of the scriptures of the Judaic Christianity in the Syriac scriptures?
I don't know of anything else that exists right now that's authoritative that was not or discovered recently or in other translations. I'm not sure what you're speaking of particularly, but I don't know of any Syriac document that would help us on this question. Go ahead.
What sources were you looking at to arrive at the idea that Jesus was trained as a physician
Jesus was trained in a physician.
in Egypt?
That's me.
Okay.
He is, in Mark's gospel particularly, he is described as a physician. Everybody interprets he has magic, God-given magic. He cures people. But he may have in reality had a real knowledge of herbs and other ways of treating people, carried them around in maybe a satchel, and he dispensed the herbs to the sick people and cured them. So my analysis is, where did he come up with that knowledge? Well, the Bible says that Jesus escaped from Palestine when Herod was out looking for him to kill him. He went to Egypt. Well, where would you go if you were in Essene and you went to Egypt? You would go to the Therapeuti, the Egyptian Essenes in Alexandria. And what were they? They were physicians. And what would they teach you as a child? They would teach you how to be a physician. So I just put the pieces together. Nobody ever stated that in antiquity, that Jesus became a physician after he was trained in Alexandria. The only reference is that he went to Egypt, and then after the death of Herod, he returned. I place the birth of Egypt in my book at 23 BC. So I give him a childhood and an adolescence in Egypt. And then he comes back, he's a well-trained physician already coming back. In the books that says Jesus did no ministry until he was 30 years of age, I think is a misnomer that is actually stating Jesus did no ministry for 30 years. and then it became. So if you take the date 27 and go back 30 years, you come to 3 AD, BC, the year that Jesus would have returned from Egypt, because he came after Herod the Great's death in 4 BC. So giving him a year to get the information and arrange to come would be 3, and going to 27 AD, and I could go through the reason I know it's 27 AD when he cleansed the temple, and that is the moment Jesus began ministry. He was just a physician prior to that. But after 27, he began teaching the doctrine of vegetarianism, communalism, and pacifism to non-Nazarene Jews in Palestine and Judea.
Christ's preaching to the Essenes saying, do not heat your food, otherwise your bowels will turn into steaming balls. He prefers fresh food and fresh bread rather than baked bread.
I never used any of that literature as my sources.
It's in the Vatican.
Well, that's what someone said, but I never used any of that as a source.
Do you believe that it should be fresh rather than baked?
I don't have any idea whether he taught that or not. I have no idea. In the history that we have, it nowhere mentions that Jesus ever taught anybody anything about vegetarianism. We have a hard time coming up with any reference to him. And as I stated earlier, the best reference I can give is where a Judaic Christian said, when asked, why are you a vegetarian? He replied, because Jesus taught me to be a vegetarian. That's the greatest, that's the best we can come up with about Jesus saying anything about vegetarianism. So I think that anything else is questionable.
1921, the book's been for sale for $1. It never went up in value. So even today, you can still get the Christ's Gospel to the Essenes.
I don't include that in what I lecture on. And I want to be able to say what I say to the greatest doubters, the most devout Christians, and be substantiated by historical documents that everybody agrees upon. That is very shaky historically. And you would find most people would reject it if you spoke on that.
It's in the Vatican.
I'm saying you could talk to groups maybe that are of like mind, but you couldn't talk to a group of, say, Catholic bishops and argue the point. I'm willing to stand in front of a group of Catholic bishops and argue everything I said, because what I say is based upon historical documents that everybody agrees is historical.
Well, they all agree that Christ spoke to the Essenes. The Catholic bishops all agree to that.
It's past 1:30 and I think I'm going to end now. Thank you all for
That's the reason I dropped in.
You should have come in and heard my lecture.
I know.
Come in at the end and